New owner demanded a 40% pay cut after 14 years of dedication. I refused, resigned, and built my own legacy. James Langdon stood in the parking lot of Oakwood Animal Clinic, his breath visible in the crisp Lexington morning. For 14 years, this place had been his life's work. A small veterinary practice he'd helped grow from a 2-room operation into a trusted community haven for pets and their families. At 41, he was the heart of the clinic, the veterinarian who knew every animal by name and every owner's story. But yesterday, everything changed. Brian Hayes, the new regional manager from Bright Paw Veterinary Partners, had sat him down and offered a 40% pay cut, claiming it was just business, to align with industry standards. Stunned, James had declined, handed in his 2-week notice, and now faced a future he hadn't planned. As he walked toward his car, resolve began to build. This wasn't just about his salary, it was about everything he'd built, everything he stood for. Your profit margins are too low, and I can see at least 3 areas for immediate cost-cutting, Brian had declared the day before, tapping his tablet screen in his expensive suit. Starting with employee compensation, James had sat across the desk, stunned into silence as Brian explained how his 14-year career at Oakwood was now worth exactly 60% of his current salary. Nothing personal, Dr. Langdon, just business, Brian said with a practiced smile. We need to align your compensation with industry standards. James's name was James Langdon, and he dedicated his entire professional life to the animals of Lexington, Kentucky. What started as a job at a small, family-owned veterinary practice straight out of vet school had grown into something he poured his heart and soul into. He was the one who'd helped the clinic expand, training every vet tech, building trust with clients who requested him by name. I understand this is a transition period, he'd replied calmly, though his heart pounded. When would these changes take effect? Next pay cycle, Brian answered, already looking back at his tablet. We'll need your decision by Friday. When old Dr. Harrington, the clinic's founder, decided to retire and sell the practice, everyone had been nervous. But Harrington had assured them Bright Paw would maintain the clinic's values. They understand what we've built here, he'd said during the announcement dinner. Now, 3 weeks after the sale was finalized, James faced a choice. Accept a massive pay cut or walk away from the practice that felt like his second home, where he'd trained staff, knew hundreds of pets by name, and where clients trusted him above all others. I appreciate your transparency, James said, standing up. I'll have my decision for you by Friday. Brian nodded without looking up. As James walked toward the door, Brian called after him, "Oh, and James, we're implementing a new scheduling system next week. The training manual is in your email." Outside Brian's office, James paused by the reception desk where Valerie was updating patient records. She'd been their receptionist for 12 years, and her concerned expression told him she already knew. You too? He asked quietly. She nodded. 30% cut, plus reduced hours. What are you going to do? James whispered, mindful of the clients in the waiting room. I don't know yet. Valerie glanced at the families with their beloved pets. A golden retriever patiently sitting beside an elderly man, a woman cradling a cat carrier, a child petting a rabbit in her lap. Something tells me things are about to change around here, she replied, and not for the better. A sense of resolve began building inside James. This wasn't just about his salary. This was about everything they'd built, everything they stood for. He looked around at the clinic that had been his life's work and knew something had to be done. He'd always believed being a good veterinarian meant more than medical expertise. It was about relationships, not just with animals but with their humans. Over 14 years, he'd vaccinated puppies and later helped those same dogs cross the Rainbow Bridge. He'd sent handwritten sympathy cards after difficult losses and celebrated miraculous recoveries. His cell phone number was saved in countless family contacts as Dr. James for emergency consultations. His apartment walls were covered with thank you cards and photos of pets he'd treated. His refrigerator displayed drawings from children whose animals he'd saved. These weren't just clients, they were connections that ran deep. You've worked with Bright Paw before, right? James asked Thomas, the newest veterinarian, during lunch the following day. At 32, Thomas had joined 6 months ago after working at a corporate practice in Nashville. He nodded grimly. 3 years. It always starts the same. Cost-cutting, Then, efficiency improvements, then pressure to upsell services. And the care quality? James asked, though he suspected the answer. Everything becomes about numbers, Thomas replied. How many patients you see per hour, how many additional services you sell, how much revenue you generate. He pushed his salad around. That's why I left. Got tired of being told to recommend unnecessary dental procedures to meet monthly targets. Later that afternoon, between appointments, James called Dr. Harrington. After 30 years of practice, Harrington had retired to a cabin by the lake, where he spent his days fishing and writing the veterinary memoir he'd always talked about. I had no idea, James, he said, his voice heavy with regret. Their representatives assured me they valued the practice's culture. I would never have sold if I'd known. It's not your fault, James assured him. You deserved your retirement. I need to make a decision. What are you thinking? Harrington asked. James hesitated. The idea had been forming, but saying it aloud would make it real. I'm considering opening my own practice. The silence on the line lasted only a moment. You should, Harrington said. You've got the experience, client relationships, and Lexington could use a clinic that still puts care above corporate margins. After they hung up, James sat in his office, looking at the degrees and certifications on the wall. His mind drifted to conversations with clients over the years, many of whom had expressed gratitude that Oakwood wasn't one of those assembly line vet clinics. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock. It was Maggie, their head technician for the past 8 years. Sorry to bother you, Dr. Langdon, but Mrs. Peterson is here with Baxter. She specifically asked for you, even though she's technically scheduled with Dr. Morris today. Tell her I'll be right there, James said, standing up. As he prepared to examine the 10-year-old beagle he'd been treating since he was a puppy, he realized what he needed to do. The decision wasn't just about his salary anymore, it was about preserving something that mattered. Friday morning arrived with a clarity James hadn't felt in weeks. He'd spent his evenings researching commercial real estate, equipment costs, and small business loans. He'd called 3 former colleagues who'd successfully established their own practices. The more he explored the possibility, the more right it felt. He knocked on Brian's door at precisely 9 o'clock. Hello. Thanks for watching and being part of this journey. If you enjoy story like this, please like, comment, and subscribe. Your support means the world. Now let's dive into the story. Come in, Brian called, his voice distracted. James entered to find him video conferencing with someone, his back half turned to the door. I'll call you back, Brian told the screen before swiveling to face him. James, good. Have you made your decision? I have, James replied, handing him an envelope. This is my 2 weeks' notice. Brian's professional mask slipped for a moment, revealing genuine surprise. You're quitting? Over a standard market adjustment? I'm pursuing a new opportunity, James corrected, and wanted to inform you properly, with time to arrange coverage for my patients. Brian leaned back in his chair, studying him. You know, I expected this reaction from some of the support staff, but not from you. You're a senior veterinarian. This is how corporate acquisitions work. Everyone needs to adjust. I understand business realities, James said carefully, and I've made a business decision of my own. Brian shrugged, already reaching for the resignation letter. We'll have HR prepare your exit paperwork. I assume you'll be joining another practice. Something like that, James answered vaguely. The news of his resignation spread through the clinic like wildfire. By lunchtime, Valerie, Maggie, and Thomas had all found moments to pull him aside. Is it true? Valerie asked, her voice barely above a whisper as they stood by the filing cabinets. Yes, James confirmed. My last day is 2 weeks from today. What will you do? She pressed. He hesitated before deciding to trust her with the truth. I'm opening my own practice. I've been looking at a space over on Maple Avenue. Her eyes widened. Really? That's... She glanced around and lowered her voice further. That's amazing, James. Throughout the day, similar conversations followed. Thomas expressed interest immediately. Keep me posted, he said meaningfully during a brief moment between patients. That evening, James sat at his kitchen table with a legal pad, making lists and plans. His phone buzzed with a text from Maggie. Whatever you're planning, count me in." It wasn't until his third cup of tea that the weight of what had happened earlier hit him. As he was leaving for the day, Mrs. Davidson had stopped him in the parking lot. Her Maine Coon, Oliver, had been his patient since she adopted him 6 years ago. "I overheard one of the techs saying you're leaving," she said, genuine distress in her voice. "Is it true?" When he confirmed it, her response was immediate. "Where are you going?" "Because Oliver and I will follow you there." That simple declaration of loyalty made him realize something he hadn't fully appreciated before. He wasn't just a veterinarian to these people and their pets, he was their veterinarian. That bond meant something Brightpaw had severely undervalued. Staring at his notes, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about refusing an unfair pay cut anymore, it was about creating something better, a practice that would honor the trust these families had placed in him. The next 2 weeks were the longest of his career. He maintained absolute professionalism, treating each animal with the same care he always had, but an undercurrent of tension ran through every interaction with management. Brian had taken to hovering during his appointments, clipboard in hand, making notes about efficiency opportunities. He scheduled an exit interview for James's final day and emailed daily reminders about his continuing obligation to non-solicitation of clients and employees, a clause that, upon review with a lawyer friend, turned out to be largely unenforceable in Kentucky. What Brian didn't know was that James had already signed a lease on a storefront just 7 minutes across town. The space had previously been a pediatrician's office, meaning much of the necessary infrastructure was already in place. He'd secured financing through a local bank where he'd been a customer for over a decade, and equipment suppliers he'd worked with for years offered favorable terms for the new practice. "We value relationships too," his medical supplier representative told him during a discreet lunch meeting, "and, frankly, we've seen what happens to quality when Brightpaw takes over. We're happy to support independent practices." In the clinic, James maintained careful silence about his plans, but word was spreading regardless. Clients would ask pointed questions during appointments. "So, where exactly will your new practice be located?" Mrs. Thompson asked while he examined her terrier's ear infection. "I haven't finalized anything yet," he replied carefully, aware of the microphone on the computer system that had been installed the previous week as part of Brightpaw's quality assurance program. She lowered her voice. "Well, when you do, please let me know. Max won't see anyone else." These conversations happened daily, and each one strengthened his resolve. He wasn't just making a career move, he was preserving a standard of care that mattered to the community. On Wednesday of his final week, Brian called him into his office again. His demeanor had changed, the corporate confidence replaced by barely concealed irritation. "Several clients have been asking about your future plans," Brian said without preamble. "I need to remind you of your contractual obligations." "I'm aware of my obligations," James replied calmly, "and I've been clear with everyone that I don't have concrete plans to announce." Brian tapped his pen against the desk. "We've invested considerably in acquiring this practice, Dr. Langdon. Brightpaw won't look kindly on any attempts to undermine that investment." "I understand," James said. "Is there anything else?" Brian studied him for a moment. "We're prepared to reconsider your compensation package. Perhaps we were too aggressive with the initial adjustment." The offer caught James off guard. It was the first sign that Brightpaw might be recognizing their miscalculation, but it was too late. The lease was signed, equipment ordered, and his vision for Riverbank Animal Hospital was already taking shape. "I appreciate that, Brian, but my decision is made." Later that afternoon, Valerie slipped a folded note onto his desk. Inside was a list of 20 client names with a simple message. "These people called today, specifically asking about you." At the bottom, she'd added, "When you're ready to hire a receptionist, call me first." That evening, James met Thomas and Maggie at a coffee shop several miles from the clinic, far enough to avoid running into anyone from Brightpaw. Over lattes, he finally shared his plans in detail. "I've secured a location on Riverbank Drive," he told them. "It'll be called Riverbank Animal Hospital, opening in about 6 weeks if everything goes according to schedule." 6 weeks, Maggie repeated, her expression thoughtful. "My reduction in hours takes effect in 3. Interesting timing." Thomas leaned forward. "What's your staffing plan?" "I need a veterinarian who shares my philosophy of care," James said, meeting his gaze directly, and an experienced lead technician. Their smiles told him everything he needed to know. By the time they left the coffee shop, his new practice had unofficially gained its first team members. The pieces were falling into place, but he had no idea that Brightpaw was about to force his hand in a way he never anticipated. His second-to-last day at Oakwood began with an unwelcome surprise. Posted on the breakroom bulletin board was a new fee schedule, effective immediately, with price increases averaging 30% across all services. Basic vaccinations that had cost $45 were now $65. Dental cleanings jumped from $300 to $425. More disturbing were the new care packages, highlighted in bold, bundled services that included tests rarely needed for healthy animals. The comprehensive wellness package included 3 separate screens that most pets simply didn't require routine visits. "They're not even trying to hide it anymore," whispered Jenna, a young vet tech who joined just before the acquisition. "Dr. Morris already told me we need to recommend the premium package to every client today." James's stomach tightened. This wasn't just corporate streamlining anymore. This was exploitative. When Mrs. Whitaker brought in her elderly cat, Chairman Meow, for his arthritis check, he found himself in an impossible position. The new protocols required him to recommend a full senior panel costing nearly $500, despite having run the same tests just 2 months earlier. "Is this really necessary so soon?" Mrs. Whitaker asked, her concern evident. Living on a fixed income, she budgeted carefully for her cat's care. "The new owners have implemented standard protocols," James explained carefully, "but in my professional opinion, given Chairman's recent normal results, we could wait another 4 months for these particular tests." She looked relieved, but his compromise was short-lived. Brian had apparently been monitoring the appointment through the new electronic system. He entered the exam room before James could complete the visit. "Mrs. Whitaker, I'm Brian Hayes, Regional Manager," he introduced himself with a practiced smile. "I couldn't help noticing that we haven't scheduled Chairman's senior wellness package today." What followed was a masterclass in pressure tactics, subtle implications that skipping these tests was neglectful, mentions of catching problems early, and finally, the closing offer of a special one-time discount that still exceeded what the tests should actually cost. James watched Mrs. Whitaker's expression shift from confusion to guilt to resignation as she finally agreed, her hands gripping her purse a little tighter. After she left, Brian pulled James aside. "Dr. Langdon, when we recommend a protocol, we expect our veterinarians to support it fully. Those tests are unnecessary right now," James said, keeping his voice low but firm. "This isn't about healthcare. It's about revenue. This is about standardized care," Brian countered. "Your personal attachment to clients is clouding your professional judgment." James nearly laughed at the absurdity. "My personal attachment to clients is called building trust. It's why this practice has thrived for decades." Brian checked his watch dismissively. "Well, thankfully, we only have to manage that approach for 1 more day." The rest of the day proceeded similarly, with Brian hovering around James's appointments and intervening whenever he didn't push the new protocols aggressively enough. By closing time, James was emotionally exhausted. As he was updating Chairman Meow's file, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. In the notes section, an administrative entry read, "Patient transfer to Dr. Morris, effective immediately. Dr. Langdon no longer primary veterinarian." A quick check of several other longtime patients revealed the same change. They were reassigning all of his patients before he'd even left. That night, he couldn't sleep. He'd planned to depart quietly, give himself time to set up his new practice, and only then let clients know of his new location. But Brightpaw's aggressive tactics and willingness to exploit client trust changed everything. At 2 a.m., he made a decision. He sat at his computer and drafted an email to the lawyer who'd been helping him establish his new practice. "Need to accelerate timeline," he wrote. "How soon can we open, even in limited capacity?" Her response came surprisingly quickly, with temporary equipment rental and creative scheduling, potentially 2 weeks. "Call me in the morning." He closed his laptop, finally able to relax enough to sleep. Tomorrow would be his last day at Oakwood Animal Clinic, and it wasn't going to go the way Brian Hayes expected. His final day arrived with a sense of both ending and beginning. He'd spent the early morning hours preparing, making calls, setting things in motion. Now, as he parked in his usual spot for the last time, he felt strangely calm. The morning passed with a series of emotional goodbyes from staff members who'd become family over the years. Even some of the newer employees, who barely knew him, seemed affected by the shift in the clinic's atmosphere. "The schedule looks light today," Valerie noted when he stopped by reception. "Brian blocked off most of my day for transition activities," James explained. "Apparently, I have a lot of paperwork to complete before I leave." What neither of them said was that his regular clients had already been redistributed among the remaining veterinarians. At noon, Brian summoned him to the conference room for what he called a departure protocol meeting. James expected the usual exit interview formalities: returning keys, signing final paperwork, perhaps a cursory acknowledgement of his years of service. Instead, he found Brian seated with two people he'd never seen before. One was introduced as Brightpaw's regional legal counsel, the other as their human resources director. "Before we process your departure, we need to address some concerns," Brian began, his tone formal. "It's come to our attention that you may be planning to open a competing practice in violation of your employment terms." The legal counsel, a stern woman in her 50s, slid a document across the table. "This is a cease and desist letter regarding any plans to practice veterinary medicine within a 20-mile radius of this facility for a period of 1 year." James looked at the document but didn't touch it. "I don't recall signing any non-compete agreement. It's incorporated in the transition documents all employees signed when Brightpaw acquired the practice," she replied smoothly. "Actually," James said, reaching into his bag, "I have copies of everything I signed." There was no non-compete clause in any of those documents. He placed his own file on the table. "My lawyer confirmed this yesterday." The atmosphere in the room shifted perceptibly. "Furthermore," he continued, "Kentucky law significantly limits the enforceability of non-competes for medical professionals, including veterinarians, particularly when patient welfare is at stake." The lawyer and HR director exchanged glances. Brian's confident expression faltered. "We're not here to debate legalities," Brian said quickly. "We simply want to ensure a smooth transition for our clients." "Your clients," James corrected gently, "and I agree completely about ensuring their care isn't disrupted." The HR director, apparently sensing an opportunity to de-escalate, adopted a conciliatory tone. "Dr. Langdon, I understand you've been with this practice for many years. Perhaps we can find a compromise that works for everyone." James smiled. "I'm always open to reasonable solutions." What followed was 2 hours of negotiations that eventually resulted in a simple agreement. James would not actively solicit Oakwood's clients for a period of 30 days, and in exchange, Brightpaw would drop any claim to restrict his practice location or timing. By the time they finished, he had officially completed his tenure at Oakwood Animal Clinic. He collected his personal belongings, said final goodbyes, and walked to his car with a mixture of nostalgia and excitement. As he was pulling out of the parking lot, his phone chimed with a message from Valerie. "Just overheard Brian on the phone with corporate. He said, he's just one veterinarian. How much impact could his leaving possibly have?" James smiled at her message and typed a quick reply. "I guess we'll find out." What Brian and Brightpaw didn't realize was that he wasn't just leaving. He was already 2 steps ahead. The wheels were in motion, and nothing would stop what was coming next. Riverbank Animal Hospital opened its doors exactly 17 days after his departure from Oakwood. The timeline had been ambitious, requiring round-the-clock work, temporary equipment rentals, and a skeleton crew working double shifts, but they made it happen. Thomas joined him as the second veterinarian. Maggie came aboard as lead technician after her hours at Oakwood were reduced to part-time, and Valerie gave her notice the day the new reception desk was installed, citing Brightpaw's hostile work environment in her resignation letter. Their first day was meant to be a soft opening, a chance to test systems with a handful of appointments before a proper launch the following week. He'd only personally called about 20 longtime clients whose pets had ongoing medical needs that he'd been managing. At 8:45 a.m., 15 minutes before their official opening, he looked out the front window to an astonishing sight. A line of people and pets stretched across their small parking lot and down the sidewalk. "Did you call all these people?" Thomas asked, eyes wide. No, James said, stunned. I only contacted a few with urgent needs. Valerie was already at the reception desk, logging into their new practice management system. I think word got around, she said with a knowing smile. As they opened the doors, familiar faces poured in. Mrs. Peterson with Baxter the beagle, the Garcias with their 3 rescue cats, Mr. Johnson and his ancient tortoise, Methuselah. We saw on the community Facebook page that you were opening today, explained Mrs. Peterson. No one wanted to miss it. By lunchtime, they'd registered over 70 pets in their new system. By closing, that number had more than doubled. Every client had the same message. They followed their veterinarian, not the clinic brand. What touched James most were the small gestures of support. Clients brought homemade cookies, congratulation cards, and small gifts for the new practice. One family even arrived with pizza for the staff's lunch. That evening, as they finally closed the doors after an exhausting but exhilarating day, James received a text from a former colleague still working at Oakwood. Emergency meeting called for tomorrow morning. Apparently, the schedule is suddenly empty. The following week exceeded even his most optimistic projections. They quickly had to expand their hours and hire additional staff to accommodate the influx of patients. By the end of their first month, they had registered over 800 pets in their system, approximately 70% of Oakwood's former client base. What surprised him most wasn't the number of clients who followed them but how they found them. They had done minimal advertising, relying primarily on word of mouth and a simple announcement in the local paper, yet clients kept coming, often mentioning they'd heard about them from friends, neighbors, or community social media groups. The neighborhood pet groups have been buzzing about your new place, one client told him as he examined her Labrador puppy. Everyone's talking about how you stood up to that corporate chain. He hadn't intended to become a symbol of resistance against corporate veterinary care, but somehow that narrative had taken hold. People shared stories about their experiences with Brightpaw's new pricing and protocols, contrasting them with Riverbank's transparent fees and individualized approach to care. 3 months after opening, James received an unexpected visitor. Dr. Harrington, his former mentor and the previous owner of Oakwood, came to tour the new practice. I had to see it for myself, he said, looking around with undisguised approval. You've created something special here, James. As they walked through the clinic, staff and clients greeted him warmly, many expressing how much they missed him but how happy they were with the new practice. I made a mistake selling to Brightpaw, he admitted quietly as they finished the tour. I should have approached you first. Everything worked out as it should, James assured him. Later that day, he received an email that brought everything full circle. It was from Brian Hayes, requesting a meeting to discuss the veterinary landscape in Lexington. James smiled as he typed his response. I'm available next Tuesday at 2 p.m. Nothing personal, just business.